Doing chapter 6, and finally, I think I can make good on my promise that this one's going to be short. As you can see here, there's only 17 slides, a little bit less than normal. This particular chapter does require explanation, so please don't think you're going to read this PowerPoint and understand it. Basically, all of classical conditioning is summed up on this slide, but unless you can decipher that, you're probably not going to be able to. Okay, so let me run through that one and then talk a little bit about operant conditioning and a little bit about punishment, and then we're done. So voila, this should be a very short chapter. And it really needs to be because I need to go mow the yard before it rains. All right, so let's get going on this. All right, so this chapter is called Learning, of course. Learning, now again, I don't know where this definition came from, if this is the current book or maybe the previous book, but the definition that it did say was learning is a relatively permanent change in behavior or knowledge. I'm not a huge fan of overly complex things. I do like things to be simplified, but there is such a thing as simplifying it so much that you miss some of the point. So I don't particularly like that definition, so I've expanded it to some extent. Learning is a relatively permanent change in behavior. I like that part. But you can learn things more than just behaviors, right? Knowledge, capabilities. You know, sometimes you don't realize that you're capable of certain things until you're taught. And then all of a sudden you're capable of things that you didn't know that you were previously able to perform. So that's not really knowledge, and it's not really behavior. Technically, it's kind of its own thing. So capability, what about attitudes? Can't we learn attitudes? I don't think that attitude fits neatly into behavior or knowledge. So I think that is very much distinctly its own thing. So a relatively permanent change in behavior, knowledge, capability, or attitude that is acquired through, it's important to know, how did you learn something? You can learn things through experience, right? That cannot be contributed to other things like illness, injury, or maturation. So let's say that you twist your ankle and now you're walking with a limp. So you learn a new way to walk, right? You have to walk. So I'll tell you this. Last year, I dropped a glass bottle in my kitchen, and I was going to drop it on my foot. So instinctively, I raised my foot up out of the way. The bottle hit the ground and shattered, but I was on one foot and off balance, and so I sort of, jumped up. So my foot was coming back down to regain balance, and I stomped right on top of a huge shard of glass. So I had to hop on over to the kitchen sink and yank out a big, several inch long piece of glass out of the bottom of my foot. Probably required stitches, but I was too stubborn to go and too cheap. So I could not put any weight on that foot for quite some time, for weeks. And that's when I was a professor at Sam Houston, and the parking at Sam Houston is ridiculous. I had to walk, I would say, 3/4 of a mile from the parking lot. Again, I was cheap. I didn't want to spend money on the close one, so I parked in the overflow parking lot, which is super far, and I had to hobble all the way uphill to class. So I certainly wasn't walking a new way. I had to learn how to walk without putting really any pressure on that foot. So that was basically due to an injury. All right, so it's not really learning, right? I just kind of had to adapt. So it's not really the same thing. So again, we can really break this down into nuances, and we can talk about all behaviors and knowledge and capabilities and attitudes as different entities, and we can talk about how things are acquired. But for an intro class, we're going to keep it somewhat simple. So I just want to point out that there is actually a lot more to learning if you break down all of the components. And if you took this class as a standalone class, you probably could take an entire class on just learning. But for an intro class, again, we're going to keep it somewhat simple. We're going to talk about the couple of major components, which is operant conditioning and classical conditioning. Those are the big ones. All right, so learning may occur consciously or without conscious awareness. Have you ever been around somebody for a while and you pick up on habits and you're not thinking about it, right? You just say or do or act kind of the way that they do because it rubs off on you. That would kind of be an unconscious awareness. It wasn't sought out. You didn't do it on purpose. Learning has been observed in fetal development and as early as 32 weeks in gestation. I'm not quite sure what that's referring to. I probably at one time knew that, Oh, my allergies are killing me today. Um, I think it has to do with playing music and observing fetal activity, and it was calming somehow. And I think whenever they played the music, the baby calmed, and they considered that learning. I don't know that I agree with that, but again, I'd have to read the full research on that to really pass judgment. So, but point to be taken here is that learning occurs right away. Like we start learning day one, basically. And it is different than instincts or reflexes. Okay, reflexes is not learned behavior; it's instinctual behavior, and so it is a different thing. There are several reflexes that happen. I will never forget um, whenever my son was born. I mean, he's born. He comes out. They clean him up, measure him, do all that stuff, pass him on to mom, and she's holding him. And almost right away, a nurse comes in saying, "Okay, let me show you how to breastfeed." And I was like, "Dude, he just got here. He's probably not hungry yet, right?" But it seemed like it was like minutes after birth, right? And so she, holds the baby in a certain way, and they show you how to do all that, and then they just kind of lightly brush the baby's cheek, and he turns towards that stimulus. Now, at this level, right? I mean, this baby is minutes old, probably not even an hour old yet, right? He doesn't have the cognitive maturity to feel a tactile stimulus and then know there's something over here. Let me turn and see what that is because I'm curious. None of that happens, right? It is purely instinct. So when she does this, he instinctually turns towards that. And when she puts like kind of the tip of her finger in his mouth, he automatically starts sucking. So you use this as a lure to get the baby to turn in the right place. And whenever the baby's mouth and nipple are in close proximity, he'll latch on, hopefully properly, and start sucking and swallowing, right? And think about that, right? That's kind of a mechanical nightmare because you're having to suck and swallow at the same time that you're breathing through your nose, right? Because otherwise, you're trying to swallow and drink, and if you try to open your mouth and take a breath, then you would start taking in gas bubbles and choking and all that. So there's a lot going on right there if you really break that down, right? That's all instinct. Nobody taught the baby how to suck. It's just a reflex. It's something that is hardwired in. So that is different than learning. All right, so let's break this down. I'm going to maximize the screen because I'm going to talk about this for a minute. This is classical conditioning. So, if you've not heard the name Ivan Pavlov, now you have. Pavlov is famous for this study. And interestingly, Pavlov is in kind of the Hall of Fame for psychologists, and he wasn't actually a psychologist. He was a physiologist, and he was studying the digestive system. So what he did, and it's kind of gruesome what he did, he had these dogs, and he like cut a hole in the side of their face, and he put a tube that went next to their salivary glands, and it like sucked the spit out of their mouth so he could measure it. And then he had another tube going into their stomach. Yeah, it was pretty horrible, right? Nobody talks about that part of it. But he discovered kind of an interesting thing. He would come in to feed these dogs to measure their digestive system and all that, and they would begin to salivate as soon as he came in the room. And he thought that was interesting because salivation is actually the first part of digestion. It occurs before food even enters your mouth. There are enzymes in your saliva that starts to break down the food even before your teeth break it down, and certainly before your stomach acids break it down. So this is considered part of the digestive process. So breaking this down and understanding the terminology, it's not particularly complicated, but there are a lot of vocabulary words here. So let's go through it one by one. So, what is the process? Well, if you bring food, what is the response that you're going to see from the dog? You're going to see salivation. Again, this is the first step of digestion. So the dog either sees the food or he smells the food, or maybe he hears you coming and know that you're feeding him. One of his sensors triggers by some kind of stimuli. The sensation is then transduced. Remember we talked about that. And then it's perceived, and there's some cognitive appraisal that goes on in this dog's mind that, ooh, I'm about to eat. So his body gets ready for that. And it does so by salivating. So the food is unconditioned stimulus. We didn't do anything to it. We didn't do any learning, no teaching, nothing, right? This is an automatic response. And it's an unconditioned, that's the word I should use. It's an unconditioned response to an unconditioned stimulus. So in other words, if you just look at this first square, food being brought brings an unconditioned response. So this is all just the natural order of things. Now, put that on pause and let's look at a different stimulus. Okay, this is food. Now we're going to look at something different. Let's look at a whistle. What happens when I blow a whistle? What response do I get in regard to salivation? We're not going to talk about is he going to bark or is he going to, sit or play or, whatever. We're asking the question, if we blow a whistle, what's the dog going to do? Okay, in response to salivation, is he going to salivate or not? Well, he's probably not, because why would he? There is no reason for his body to kick into digestive mode because of a whistle, right? So this would then be considered a neutral stimulus because it doesn't do anything, and there is no conditioned response observed through the application of this stimulus. Okay, so we understand this one. We bring food, we get a natural reaction here. So this is unconditioned because it is just natural. In this one, we have a neutral stimulus. It doesn't do anything, and there is no salivation. So there's no conditioned response here. Now here's where it gets interesting. Now we're going to combine an unconditioned stimulus with a neutral stimulus. And this combination is the key. Every time we bring this food, we're going to blow this whistle. Now, what response are we going to get? Now we're going to get salivation. We didn't from the whistle alone, but we did from the food. Now we're adding the whistle to the food. The dog is learning to associate these two things together, and he is now acquiring a response. Okay, we still have an unconditioned response at this point because the food is again causing a natural reaction. Just like up here. Oh, I went the wrong way. So, natural reaction, we get an unconditioned response, right? Neutral stimulus, we get a no conditioned response whatsoever. Now we got the food plus the whistle. Well, we're right back here to an unconditioned response because, again, it's being caused by the food here. Where that changes is when I take the food back out of the equation. So we've been doing this for a while now, food plus whistle at the same time or in close frequency with one another. Now, what happens whenever I just blow the whistle? Well, it's like ringing the dinner bell, right? The dog knows whistle means food because he's associated these two things together now. Once these things have been associated, this whistle goes from being a neutral stimulus that caused no response to being a conditioned stimulus, which creates a conditioned response. So, it gets a little tricky, a lot of words here to remember, but we've got an unconditioned stimulus providing an unconditioned response, in other words, natural reaction. We have a nothing reaction, just neutral and no response because there's no association there. But then we, as the researcher, pair these things together. We acquire, I'll get to those words in a second, we acquire a response through basically teaching and learning. All right, and now we're still getting the unconditioned response because we have them paired, but now when we take the unconditioned stimulus out of the equation, the whistle now goes from being neutral to conditioned because we have taught the dog that the whistle and the food come together and we're going to get that salivation response. So, looking at some of the, I'm frozen. Some of the terminology. So this is all the terminology that I just used, all right? You probably don't have to memorize these things, okay? I don't foresee this being test questions, all right? This is kind of a lot of wordy stuff. So don't so much worry about memorizing this. Just have kind of a vague understanding of kind of how it works, okay? If you can kind of understand this, then you shouldn't focus too much on that, okay? In other words, learn these more by looking at this than trying to memorize these definitions, okay? Because that's a lot of words. Now, these are a different story. These you need to understand. This is probably the gist of the test questions are about these particular questions. So, Acquisition refers to the development of a conditioned response. This right here is acquisition. Okay, we're pairing these two things together so that, think of the root word for acquisition, right? Acquire. We're trying to have the dog acquire an association between those two things. Okay, now contiguity, different from contingency. Two different words, all right? So you got to pay close attention that you don't miss this because you read too fast on the test, okay? Contiguity is the duration of time between the CS and the UCS. Now, let's go back to this. Let's say that as I'm feeding the dog, right, literally as I'm handing him the food, I'm blowing the whistle, okay? It's happening simultaneously. Is the dog going to associate the whistle and the food? Absolutely. They're happening at the same time. What if we increase that time? What if I blow the whistle, count to 3, and then put food down? And every time I do that same thing. I blow the whistle, 1001, 1002, 1003, here's your food. Is he then going to create that pairing? Is that acquisition going to take place? Probably so. Okay, 3 seconds is not a very long time. We haven't talked about memory yet, but that's still short-term memory, very much so. He's probably going to make that association. Now, let's keep going with the time. Let's say I blow the whistle and I wait a minute, and then I give the food, and then I blow the whistle again. Do you think after we've done this whistle, wait 1 minute, and then food? Let's say we've done that 15 times, the last 5 days, 3 meals a day. Let's say we've done that. So after 5 days, do you think that I can blow the whistle and gauge a salivation response? Will that whistle then become conditioned because this acquisition has been made? It's hard to say. I don't really know. It depends on how smart the dog is. Different breeds of dogs, the smarter end of dogs, they might make that association, but a minute is a long time. To remember that whistle and then a minute and then food, maybe, maybe not. Now, let's look at an extreme example. What if I blew a whistle and I waited 3 hours and then I walked in there with a bowl of food? Does the dog have any reason to associate the whistle with the food if 3 hours has elapsed between those two things? Probably not. So there will probably be no acquisition because the contiguity was too great. We can't associate those two things together. They happened too far apart, okay? So the less time in between, the greater the association, right? Somewhat common sense there, but just want to point it out. Now, contingency is the obvious correlation between those two things. So in this case, we're blowing a freaking whistle, right? There's no missing that, especially to a dog, right? So let's say we wanted to do something subtle. Let's say we wanted to, like maybe as we're going to give the dog the food, maybe we winked at him, right? We just looked at the dog, and then we set the food down. Do you think that we could create an acquisition there to where we could walk in the room and just go, and then little Fido here starts salivating all over the place? I'm going to guess probably not in that case. That's probably too subtle. That facial expression, I don't think dogs are that tuned in to that peculiar of a facial expression. Now, you might get all excited and be like, you want to eat? Do you want to eat? You know, go crazy like that. And then they get all stirred up and excited. So that would be a little more obvious, and I think they probably would pick up on that. So that's what contingency is referring to, is the obvious correlation between two things, all right? It's got to be obvious enough to notice, not so subtle that you don't notice. So there's a famous, God, I say it's famous and now I can't remember it. There was a guy that had a horse. He trained his horse to answer questions like math questions and stuff, and he would like, the horse would stomp his hoof, and people didn't believe, people thought it was some kind of trick, and so he'd say, okay, well, you do it. You ask him the question. And so these people would come up and they would ask the horse, like, what's 2 plus 3? And the horse would stomp like 5 times, something along those lines. I'm sort of embellishing a little bit, but simple questions, and he would get simple solutions, right? Well, it turned out he had actually trained the horse to tune in to his subtle facial expressions. And so he would be behind the asker of the question, and he would like wink or do whatever it was that he did. I can't remember what it was now. And the horse would answer the question. So, he was able to teach those subtle things like that. So, again, I don't know if dogs can pick up on that or not. But contingency refers to the obvious correlation between the two things that you're trying to pair. Now, let's talk about something called extinction. Extinction happens, back to our graph here, pictogram. So, I'm bringing food, the dog salivates. We established that. I blow a whistle, nothing happens, no salivation, right? I pair them together, right? This acquisition, the contiguity is short duration. The contingency is great enough that it's obvious, right? So we achieve acquisition, right? Now whenever I blow the whistle, the dog salivates. Now, what happens whenever I walk in and I blow the whistle? Well, the dog salivates, right? Why? Because he's going to get food and he knows that. But what if I don't give him food? What if after I teach this pairing, I come in here and blow the whistle, he's going to salivate, but I just leave. And then I come back a couple hours later and I blow the whistle. He's going to salivate. He's going to go crazy. He wants food. But I don't give him food. And this goes on over and over and over again for a while, right? Let's say a day or so. There is going to come a point where I blow this whistle and we're back to square two. It reverts back to becoming a neutral stimulus because just like we taught the dog the acquisition here, when I blow the whistle and I don't pair it with food, I'm essentially reteaching him. Now I'm teaching him that a whistle just means a whistle. And I'm going to go from a conditioned response back to no conditioned response. So this is called extinction. So it's acquisition to pair them together, but then once I break them apart and I basically reteach the dog that a whistle's just a whistle, now we have an extinction that occurs. So a conditioned response disappears if the association between the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus is broken. This is not forgetting. The dog didn't forget that the whistle means food, right? We have retrained him. Now, after extinction occurs, repairing them together causes what they call spontaneous recovery. So this acquisition doesn't occur the first time, okay? This acquisition might take, again, it depends on the individual, it depends on the dog, all these kinds of things. But let's say it takes 10 times for the dog to really associate these two things together, all right? Now we retrain him by taking the food out of the equation. So now we just blow the whistle, no salivation occurs, okay? Now we want to go back and retrain him again. We want to reacquire this. Do you think it's going to take 10 times? It took 10 times the first time. The second time we get what they call spontaneous recovery. Now spontaneous recovery could be 1 time, 2 times, maybe 3 times, but it is going to certainly be much, much quicker. So I'll tell you this, at the job that I'm at now at Amazon, I had to do all this forklift training, right? There's all these different forklifts that they use to do different things. There's a 4-foot and a 6-foot, and then there's like what they call a side rider. It's basically a pallet jack that you can drive and ride on, but it's not really forklift. It's more for transporting a couple of pallets, at a time. Then they have this big machine called a turret that you sit in like a cockpit, and the whole platform goes up 5 levels, and you're up on that level with it, and your forks are actually sideways, and they go in, and it's a very narrow aisle. Anyway, there's a whole bunch of what they call pits, powered industrial, trucks, powered industrial trucks. And I went through the training for it. Now, the people that got hired with me are the receiving dock people and the stowers and the unloaders and all that. And that's all they do is operate these forklifts. It took, and I'm going to brag a little bit here, but it's because of this. So it took most people 4 to 5 hours to really kind of master the machine before they were able to pass. You have to do like basically an obstacle course. You have to do like figure eights. You have to pick up pallets and put it between lines and all that. And then they sign off saying, okay, yeah, you're good enough that we'll let you out on the floor next to millions of dollars worth of merchandise using this equipment, because these things weigh about 3 or 4 times as much as a car does. So it took most people 3 to 4 hours to master it and pass their test. It took me 20 minutes. And part of that is because I'm a little older, have a little more experience, and a little, maybe better hand-eye coordination than some of them. Don't forget, my generation grew up playing video games. So pretty good with that. But I think part of it is because I drove a forklift for like 6 months when I was 19 years old. So I sort of had this spontaneous recovery. I got in there and I played the throttle forward and back, and I did the steering to see how tight it was, and it was like I never stopped driving one. And I only did it for like 6 months, and it was 20 years ago. But I got in there and I just felt like a natural, and it just blew everybody away because they're like, "Oh, you got experience," and I was like, "No." And I guess I lied because I do have experience, but again, it was 20 years ago, and I only worked there for like 6 months, and I only actually touched a forklift about once a week. So, I've probably been on one like 8, 10 times in my life ever. So, we probably all have, it's like learning Spanish or whatever foreign language they learn in school, right? You don't use it very often, so you forget all of it. But then all of a sudden you get a job where you work next to Spanish speakers and you start hearing words and they come back to you really quickly, right? You reacquire that knowledge much quicker the second time around than you did the first time around. Okay, so that's extinction. Now, other concepts here, and these get a little tricky because they're very similar. Something called generalization. Generalization is the tendency to respond to stimuli that are similar. So, this is an old school whistle, right? It's got like a little cork ball in it, right? And you blow, and that little cork ball rattles around really, really quickly, and it creates that ear-piercing sound. What if we have this acquisition here between the whistle and the food, causing this unconditioned response, and instead of bringing this old-timey whistle, let's say I brought like an electronic whistle that made a very similar sound. Do you think if I came in there with an electronic whistle and I played that similar sound, the dog would still salivate? And you would argue, well, but you have an electronic whistle and there has been no conditioning for that. So why are you getting a conditioned response? Well, that would be because of generalization. The tendency to respond to something that's very similar. All right, it's not the exact sound, but it's close enough that it fools the dog. All right, so that's generalization. Now, the opposite of that would be discrimination, the learned ability to distinguish between the two. So maybe I bring a certain kind of food that the dog really likes with the cork whistle, but then the electronic whistle that sounds pretty similar, but also distinctly different, kind of at the same time. Like it's the same, what do I want to say? The same loudness. It's basically the same pitch, but it's a slightly different mechanical sound. Maybe on that day I bring food that the dog won't eat. All right. So eventually the dog will learn to discriminate between that's the good whistle with the food I like, and that's the bad whistle that sounds similar, but I don't like that. So here's a scary example. John Watson, famous psychologist, very interesting dude too, by the way. When you take history of psychology, you'll like this guy. He had a lot of scandals and stuff in his life. He was a psychology chair at Johns Hopkins University, very well known for their psych program. He was a behaviorist, by the way. He conditioned a phobia into this little baby Albert. This is an actual picture of what he did. Now, baby Albert loved this rabbit, right? I mean, as any kid would, right? It's soft and fluffy and furry and it's warm and it's all the things that babies like, right? So he would let little baby Albert here play with this rabbit, and Albert loved it. So then he started conditioning. He did this, right? So there is a natural response here. So the rabbit, in this case, is the unconditioned stimulus, and the response in the baby is, let's say, happiness, okay? So rabbit, the response, joy, happiness, however you want to call it, right? Now, he introduced a very scary neutral stimulus, right? Which in this case was, now we're going to change this up a little bit. I don't want to be confusing, but he had a gong, and he would sneak up behind baby Albert while he was playing with the rabbit, and he would bash this gong right in baby Albert's behind his ear or whatever. So imagine what a baby's going to do, right? They don't like to be startled. They don't like to be scared. Obviously, it's going to scare the crap out of him. So he would start screaming and crying, right? So that was kind of it was kind of we're kind of getting away from this model a little bit because we have an unconditioned response with a rabbit that's causing an unconditioned response of joy, but then we have an unconditioned gong that's also doing an unconditioned response, which in this case is fear. So we're kind of skipping this because it wasn't neutral. We have one that's very positive and we have one that's very negative, and then he paired those two things together to see what would happen. And what ended up happening is baby Albert learned every time he pet this rabbit, he would get scared and startled, and he knew it was coming. And so as soon as he would put the rabbit down, the baby then started crying because he knew what was coming. So it's also worth mentioning that the baby was unable to distinguish between the rabbit and things that were similar to the rabbit. So it got to where this baby had a phobia of the rabbit that he previously enjoyed, but he also had a phobia to anything that was furry or anything that resembled that rabbit, even a stuffed rabbit. He wasn't able to distinguish between the fake rabbit and the real rabbit, even though he would understand there are two different things. In his mind, the same thing is going to happen with the gong. And, you know, there's all these legends about he grew up and he was afraid his whole life, and he committed suicide at the age of 20. There's another rumor that he was very badly adjusted as an adult and basically lived longer than 20, didn't kill himself, but he was never the same. Like, this scarred him for life. And by the way, this kind of an unethical thing would never be approved today. In our research now with IRBs, institutional review boards, they would never approve this for this very reason, because psychologists didn't really have the foresight back then, or maybe they just didn't care. I like to think they didn't think it through, that this could cause emotional scarring. The truth is, nobody knows who this baby was. There's been several major investigations by historians to figure out who this baby was. Some say that it's the illegitimate son of one of his research assistants. Some say that it was somebody that volunteered their baby for the study for a small amount of money that was being paid. But there's no record, so nobody knows who this baby was and what his ultimate, did he outgrow that phobia and live a normal life or whatever. So anyways, kind of an interesting application towards humans. So that's, in a nutshell, that is classical conditioning. This is something that's still very much studied today, especially in the educational world. All of this chapter, by the way, very much utilized by education academia. A lot of this is still very appropriate and hasn't been disproven or even really updated much. This is essentially how we learn. So that's one way. Now the second way, and second part of the chapter, is operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is positive and negative reinforcement, which I know you've heard of. So let's break down what that means. Now let me start off by saying people get this wrong a lot. Okay, and there's a video that I'll include on the video links that's from the Big Bang Theory where they point that out. It's pretty funny. So the way that people learn this wrong is they think of positive and negative as good and bad. Positive reinforcement is good reinforcement, and negative reinforcement is bad reinforcement. And there's logic to that, but don't forget the English language is weird and kind of sucks in some ways, right? So positive and negative do mean that, good and bad, but not in this case, okay? In this case, positive and negative is more mathematical. Positive meaning addition and negative meaning subtraction. So if we're going to add something, it's positive. If we're going to remove something, it's negative, and that's for both reinforcement and punishment. Now, in order to figure out which one is which, well, are we trying to increase the likelihood of a behavior? Then that's reinforcement. Or are we trying to decrease the likelihood of a behavior? Well, that's punishment. All right? Clear as mud? All right. We'll work through it, okay? It'll come to you as we go through these couple chapters, or a couple examples. So positive enforcement, or reinforcement rather, is when you add something to increase behavior. Okay, we want to give you positive reinforcement so that you will continue to do that. We will give you negative reinforcement. Again, we're going to take something away in this case. A lot of time it's going to be, we're going to take away something positive in order to increase the likelihood of behavior. So let's look at some examples here. All right, Jennifer Lawrence wins an Oscar, right? Academy Award. This would be an example of positive reinforcement, right? We're adding something here. We're adding a trophy. We're adding recognition in order to get more of that behavior, right? We want her to continue to make good movies, and so we're going to give her this award so that she'll go out there and make more good movies, right? So anytime you add something like an award or praise or reinforcement like that, then this is considered positive reinforcement. In this case, here we have, I'm going to assume that's mom and kid, and I'm going to assume maybe she's saying something nice to him. She's certainly embracing him. So we have this love and affection, and he probably did something good to deserve that, right? Maybe he did his chores. Maybe he said something nice. Maybe he's just flat out good kid. So he's getting positive reinforcement from his parent because this attachment, which we'll talk about in another chapter, is extraordinarily important. So this is a need that this child is being satisfied by this mother in order to increase whatever that behavior was. So again, positive reinforcement here. Now, again, you can overthink these really easily, and this is an intro class. Graduate students sometimes overthink this. So if you don't think too long and too hard about it, it's easier than if you try to second guess it. Once you start second guessing it, you'll get it all confused in your head, all right? So, probably the hardest one to understand. This person, okay, I got a person right here sitting in a red light, and what are they doing at the red light? What everybody does, playing on their phone, right? Light turns green, they don't move. This person wants them to move, so they lay on the horn. Does it work? Most of the time, right? This person wants the honking to stop. So we are going to take something away, which is their peace of mind, right? By doing this. So we are removing something, their peace of mind, in order to increase the likelihood of a behavior. Honking makes them go, okay? Again, don't overthink this. You can spin this around and think of it from a different perspective and change it. I'm not going to be hard on the test on questions about this because this is very complicated and this is hard to teach online. All right, so nagging, right? Same sort of principle, right? Do the dishes. I'll do them later. I want you to do the dishes. I'm going to do my homework first. I want you to do the dishes. But I watch a TV show. I want you to do the dishes. Oh my God, fine. I will go do the dishes so that you will shut up. Okay? We are removing this person's peace, right? By the nagging. So the nagging is to increase the likelihood of a behavior that we desire. In this case, chores. Okay? So if we're going to add something here in order to increase behavior, positive because we're adding, increasing behavior, reinforcement, positive reinforcement. Next, we're going to remove something that they want in order to increase behavior. So it's still reinforcement, but now we have the removal instead of the addition of something. So this is negative reinforcement. Now, you probably have to make this big for you to be able to really see what this says. This guy's jacket says, "Ask my girls if they still think short shorts are so cute." And he's wearing jean shorts, which is a no-no in the first place, with leggings, super short, and then he's walking all around, of course, Walmart, because where else would you see this, right? Of course it's Walmart. You wouldn't see this in Target, right? So this guy's walking around or Walmart, rather, basically embarrassing his daughter. So we are adding something, right? We are adding shame. We are adding embarrassment, right? So we know it's positive something. And what's he trying to do? He's trying to decrease the behavior, right? He's trying to take this want away from her. She wants to wear short shirts. He's going to embarrass her, make her feel silly. So next time she thinks about wearing short shirts, she's going to think, nope, I don't want dad to walk me through Walmart like that again, right? So this is the addition of something to decrease behavior. So it's positive, and then it's back to our words. Where were they? Right here. Nope, that's not right. Here we go. So we're adding an adverse stimulus. So that's punishment. Okay. Now again, you can say, oh, well, what about the horn? You could say that's adding an adverse stimulus. Stop right there. Don't overthink it, all right? It's complicated. There's more to it we're not going to get into. You're going to have really easy examples. Don't worry about that. So when we add an adverse stimulus in order to decrease a behavior, we're going to call this positive punishment, okay? The word escaped me for a second. All right, same thing with corporal punishment, right? Spanking. We're adding something, in this case, pain, and we are trying to decrease a behavior. What happens whenever you spank them and they go, thank you, I'll have another? Then you got to abandon that right there. That's not punishment. That's clearly not working, and you need to stop doing that. All right, then the last one here, this is pretty much the go-to for most parents, is we're going to remove something. So we have negative, right? The removal of what they want, which in this case is a phone or permission to use the car. So this would be negative punishment. Again, you're going to see super easy examples on this. I want you to understand the basic concept, not be able to identify nuances between them, because again, they're very, very similar. All right, so last thing on the chapter. Yeah, that pretty much sums up where we're at, right? Operant conditioning is one of the trickiest things to learn and get right. And to be quite honest, I probably don't teach it very well. So I'm not going to hold you accountable for that. All right, last thing here is punishment. Let's talk about punishment for a second. But first, can we just take a second and appreciate this graphic punishment, right? Fittingly, the Punisher. We have all these other cool vigilantes. I mean, the artwork here, it's just awesome, right? I mean, come on. How awesome is that? All right, let's talk about punishment. Punishment, again, the removal of a pleasant stimulus or the application of an unpleasant stimulus, thereby lowering the probability of a response. So, positive punishment, once again, is a decrease in behavior that results from adding a consequence, right? The spanking or the shaming. And a negative punishment is a decrease in behavior. Again, still a decrease in behavior because it's punishment. But in this case, it's because we removed some kind of positive consequence like phone privileges or late bedtimes or whatever it might be. Now, here's what punishment doesn't do right, or here's what people don't get right about punishment. First of all, punishment does not extinguish behavior. It just suppresses it. Now, what does that mean? Whenever I was married, my kids were 3 and 5, and they would always come to the dinner table with toys. And it was a problem because A, they're not focused on eating, they're playing with toys, that's not good. And B, they would inevitably, their toys end up spilling their drink or knocking something over or getting in the way, and it was just annoying. So no toys at the dinner table. That was the rule. So they would come to the table and they would put the toy under their chair. And it took a little while, but as things do as a parent, and they finally got that. They knew that that was the rule and that was the way that it was. That was my rule. It was my pet peeve. So they did that. And like when we would go to McDonald's, for instance, of course they want the Happy Meal toy first, right? No. We're going to take the toy and we're going to set it over here. You're going to eat the meal. When the meal is done, we're going to clean up the meal. When all of that is clean and there is no more food on the table, now you may have the toy. That's the order that it happens all the time, right? But again, that's my rule. So I get divorced and I'm seeing the kids, on my weekends and whatnot. And all of a sudden we go to Walmart and all of that learning undone. Why? Because mom didn't enforce it. So there no longer was a punishment involved. So it was very clearly it was kind of like the extinction that we talked about, right? That acquisition of consequence. If I break this rule, there will be a consequence. And I have thrown away more than one Happy Meal toy because they know the rule, they broke the rule, they had a crappy attitude about it, so now you don't get the toy at all. So it just goes in the trash. So, honestly, we're here for food, not buying toys. So I'm okay with that. So because it wasn't enforced, right, it suddenly reverted back to, it's like they don't know any different. Think about whenever there might be some of you that have your own place, maybe recently, right? So what happens when you live at home, right? Mom's always on your butt to clean your room, right? Clean your room, clean your room, clean your room. You hear it all the time, right? So you do it, again, to stop the nagging, right? But what happens when you get your own place and you don't have anybody there telling you, clean your room, clean your room, clean your room? It goes back to being a slob again, right? There's that rebellious side of you that doesn't want to clean just because you don't have to clean, right? So punishment doesn't extinguish behavior, it only suppresses it until the punisher disappears. And as soon as that's not being enforced anymore, then the behavior typically comes back. Now, hopefully, there's been a seed planted that you should keep a clean room, and you do it long enough that you get your own place, and you're a slob, and then you look around after the first couple of weeks after you're, I'm on my own, I can do what I want. You get that whole thing out of your system, right? And then you're like, oh my God, this place is a mess. You're not used to living in a mess, right? Because your mom always made you keep your room clean. So next thing you know, you're keeping your own place clean, even though mom's not there enforcing the rule, but it's just because that's what you grew up with and you want what you're used to. So that's one thing to note, is that punishment does not extinguish behavior, it only suppresses it. Number two, this one is the one that I see missed most often by parents. It indicates unacceptable behavior, but it fails to teach appropriate alternatives. So what happens when little Johnny comes home and he hands you a report card and it's straight D's? And as a parent, you know that's not good, right? So you punish. So what do? Give me your phone, no TV for you, go to your room. So they do. And you're going to do that for the next 6 weeks. And then they come home 6 weeks later and they bring you a report card and it's all D's. Well, you can't be mad at the kid. That's because you never corrected them. You never did what you need to do as a parent to correct the initial bad behavior. So you punished it, but you didn't fix it. So why was he making D's? Is it because he just wasn't doing his homework? Well, just because you take away his phone and take away his TV doesn't mean he's going to do his homework, right? So he's going to go in his room and he's going to read more books than he used to, sleep a little more than he used to. He's still not going to do his homework. So there needs to be an adjustment of behavior, not just the punishment for the unacceptable behavior. And that gets missed a lot of times, right? Whether it be out of anger or just not really thinking the problem through. So little Johnny comes home with straight D's. Okay, we have to address that. First, we need to find out, well, why? Do you not understand the material? Are you not turning in your assignments? There's all kinds of reasons that it could be, right? Let's address that. I need to be more punctual with checking your homework. I need to be maybe getting you additional help. Maybe you need tutoring. Maybe you need to stay after class. I need to be in communication with your teacher. Those things teach appropriate alternatives. Now, you can still add the punishment. Look, this is unacceptable. This should have never gotten this bad to begin with. So there is a punishment, involved, but you also have to address the behavior. Okay, and then 3 and 4 kind of go together. You see this with really heavy-handed parenting that just punish, every little thing. It starts to engender fear, anger, and hostility in your kid. And think about that. You've ever had a boss that's just always up your ass for everything that you do, right? I would become pretty angry at that. I would not handle that very well. You would see some hostility, and you would see me doing things on purpose to probably sabotage that job, right? And kids do the same thing. They act out because they're angry, and they're not able to deal with that anger because A, they're children, and B, you keep piling it on. So it engenders fear, anger, and hostility, and it sometimes can lead to aggression. All these emotions boil over at some point, and you'll see that, kid that screams and yells at you, and gets really angry and mad because they don't really know how to deal with the kind of constant punishments. All right, so these I think you'll see again, so make sure you understand those. Last couple things here. I'm not really going to talk about escape learning too much. Avoidance learning is learning to avoid events or conditions that are associated with adverse consequences. So avoidance learning is learning to just not put yourself in situations that are bad. Maybe you are a little bit social phobic, right? So don't go to your company Christmas party, right? If those kinds of settings cause you anxiety or fear or whatever, you have some kind of phobia that you're going to be called out to give a speech or something like that, or somebody at work that has a crush on you is going to ask you to dance, and then you're left with either dancing, which you don't like doing, or telling him no and then dealing with him every day after rejecting him. Just don't go. So that's avoidance learning. Simply kind of having the foresight to know something bad could happen here, and I'm not going to go down that road. pretty much common sense, just a type of learning, dealing with consequences. And this last one is interesting to me: learned helplessness. Not sure if you've ever heard this term before, but learned helplessness is a passive resignation to adverse conditions that is learned through repeated exposure to seemingly inescapable or unavoidable adverse events. And this, before I learned it in grad school, like what this was about, it kind of just didn't make sense to me, because here I am, a cop in the projects, and I knew everybody that lived there, and there were people that I would talk to. I'm a people person, at least I was a people person, so I used to talk to everybody all the time, and it was interesting to me the different responses that I would get from like the teens, right? Because some of them, absolutely everybody hated living there for the most part, but you would talk to some of them and they would talk about, I'm going to do this and get out. And most of the time it was, I'm going to be a pro baller or I'm going to be a rapper. That was 95% of everybody that was going to get out. That was their ticket out. But there was quite a few people that I would say, like, what are you going to do about jobs? Man, I ain't going to get no job. Well, why? Don't you want out of here? Man, I ain't got no way out. What do you mean you don't have any way out? You can go and get student loans, which, yes, you have to pay them back, but you will qualify for them, right? You can get into school, you can get a degree and literally anything that you want, and then you can pursue that as a career. Like, your parents don't have a career, your mom doesn't have a job or whatever because she didn't really do that, but your future's not set. You could go do, man, I can't do that. Tell me why. Tell me why you can't do that. Give me a reason that you can't. Man, look around me, man. I can't. Man, ain't nobody here do that, man. I can't do that. And it was this sense of learned helplessness. It was this sense of, I can't do that because look around. This is the life. This is what life has dealt me. And the only people that get out of here through luck. Not hard work, not, having a plan. It just, some people get out, some people don't. And I'm probably unlucky and I won't. So I didn't really get that at the time, but I guess since then, my life has taken some sharp lefts here and there that I didn't expect. And I've kind of found myself in that frame of mind a couple of times where, this is my lot in life. Like, this is what I deserve, and this is karma and fate, and you chalk it up to however you need to chalk it up, but essentially it's just learned helplessness. It's kind of sad, and it's really hard to break through. You can't. It's emotional based. It's not logic based, and so most of the time when you go to therapy, they help you deal with your emotions, right? And I'm a very logical person, so I steer everything towards thinking things logically through, and that just doesn't work for this. You can't logically teach somebody to undo the thinking patterns that involved in this learned helplessness. So this one's kind of an interesting for me. All right, and then the last thing here, Albert Bandura, another very Hall of Famer for psychologists, famous for social learning theory. Observational learning is learning by observing the behaviors of others and the consequences of that behavior. So, in a nutshell, imitating. You see somebody do something and you imitate that behavior. And children do this a lot. Little kids do this. They pick up on your habits. They pick up on the words that you use, the way that you act, the way that you do things. And it's always the habits that you don't want them to pick up on that they do, like cursing and that kind of stuff. You're like, I hope my kid doesn't do it, but that's the stuff they see and they want to imitate and learn, and you're like, oh crap, I didn't want you to learn that word. But he breaks down learning, and this isn't rocket science. Sometimes these theories in psychology are really, really insightful, and it's cool that they were able to think about it. But this one's pretty much common sense, just breaking down, kind of how do we learn something. Well, he breaks it down into these 4 basic steps. The first thing is, well, you have to pay attention, right? You can be in my class all day long and stay on your phone the entire time or sleep the entire time, and you will learn literally nothing, right? Because you're not paying attention. So that just goes to make sense, right? You have to hear the information, you have to process the information, you have to sort of retain some of that information into memory and understand it, and then be able to apply it. that's learning, right? So just simply being there and not paying any attention, you're not learning anything, right? So that's kind of the obvious place to start. The second one is retention. I just kind of mentioned, right? You have to be able to store some of it in memory, because you see a task, and then in order to replicate that task, right, you have to sort of walk through those steps. And if you don't remember what the steps were, well, then you didn't really learn. So you have to pay attention, you have to be able to retain it, and then these last two, you have to be physically and cognitively capable of performing that behavior. So, in other words, let's say that I was going to give a seminar on quantum mechanics, or better than that, theoretical astrophysics, okay? And I start on the board with basic physics equations, right? Basics if you know quantum mechanics. Do you know quantum mechanics? I'm going to assume no. Probably not, okay? So where I'm starting at is already above your head. So you're not able to really pay attention to it because you don't understand it. You're certainly not able to retain it because you can't scaffold that on knowledge that you already have because you've never taken physics. And I'm doing advanced quantitative theories, and then I'm tying it into astronomical events. Again, something else you don't know maybe much about. So you're not cognitively capable of performing that behavior, so you're not going to learn anything from that seminar. Now, I have to bring it down to the level of wherever you're starting at, and then you would be cognitively capable of it. But you gotta start at the starting point. I can't start way up here and you're way down here, right? You also, if we're learning something physical, of course, you have to be physically capable of it. If I'm going to teach you how to do a backflip, right, I'm going to talk about having your feet shoulder width apart. I'm going to talk about, getting a little bit of a squat. I'm going to talk about exploding and jumping and at the same time throwing it. And if you're a paraplegic, pretty sure you're not going to learn how to do a backflip, right? Because you're not physically able. You pay attention all day long. You can retain all of the steps, but if you're not physically able to do it, well, then you didn't learn how to do a backflip, okay? So that's kind of an obvious example. And then the last thing here, and again, this is a little bit insightful, you have to be motivated. I have observed 1,000 things that I have paid attention to. I can retain what I've learned. I would be cognitively capable of performing it if I wanted to, but I don't want to. I don't care. I don't want to learn that. All right, and this is what the hang-up is for a lot of people that take intro psych as a class that's just a prerequisite. You don't care about it. When I took all the history classes that I had to take, this was my problem. I paid attention. I could retain facts and figures and dates and all that kind of stuff. I was cognitively capable of it, but I wasn't motivated to learn history. It's just not interesting to me. At the time, it wasn't. And, I was an average student, nothing to write home about because I wasn't properly motivated. This is where really good teachers come in. Really good teachers are able to motivate kids to want to learn that stuff, right? I don't put myself in that category at all. I was an English teacher for one semester in high school, and I hated it. It was a paycheck for me. I didn't have a calling to be a teacher. I didn't like the school that I was at. I didn't particularly like but about 2 kids in all my classes. And if you want to put your head down and go to sleep and get an F, I would just talk quieter so that I wouldn't wake you up. I did not care. I'm not going to motivate you to do the work. If you're not self-motivated, I don't care. You can get an F and take this class again next year. That's just job security for me. So that's a horrible teacher, horrible, piss poor teacher. That's why I didn't go back. But really good teachers are able to, come on, put your phone away. Come on, do this. Come on, you can do it. They're good at, they're cheerleaders. They're really good at motivating. Again, if you're self-motivated, then this is not a problem for you. A lot of people are externally motivated. Again, topics we'll talk about in another class. So this is broken down. You have to pay attention. You have to retain the information. You have to be physically or cognitively able to do it, and you have to be motivated. You have to want to do it. And if all these 4 things are in place, then you can learn stuff. All right. I don't know how long that was, but it was definitely shorter. So done with chapter 6. I'm going to get this posted, and we're on to chapter 7. All right. You guys keep on keeping on.